So we're back after a several month hiatus.
Here's my thing. I just don't feel like we need an explanation. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Like, I
Yeah.
just don't feel like we need to explain why we've been gone for
There will
a year.
be no explanation. There will just be reputation.
So today we are going to be talking about graduate student admissions, which this is actually like this is a subject that you and I have been trying to do from like the
Yes.
beginning of this podcast, and
This
we have
was the
not been able to do it.
This
So
was the second podcast that we had filmed, and we realized that we absolutely had no business doing this ourselves.
we
So
literally
we decided,
looked at our list and we looked at the schools that we applied to and then the schools that we got into, and we both looked at each other and we were like, we weren't really good at this.
no, we weren't. Maybe we should bring in someone who knows what they're talking about. And that is why we brought our PhD advisor in to have a conversation with us today about how to actually apply to grad school, because we have no idea what we're talking about. And he actually reads applications and has been doing this for over like 10 years or something like that. So in our conversation with Jared, we talked about the most important parts of your application, including where you actually decide to apply, the letter of rec, the personal statement, test scores, GPA, all of the critical components of your application, and what to focus on and what not to focus on, and some little sprinkles of insight in between. So we're really excited for you to hear this conversation that we had, and I hope you enjoy.
Okay, basically, we are here today with Jared Shaw, our graduate advisor from UC Davis. Jared is currently a faculty member at UC Davis with how many years of experience would you say of reviewing graduate school applications at this point?
I would say reviewing applications, 10 years. I've spent on the grad admissions committee off and on, but I've been involved in the application process, obviously, for a long time.
So let's start by talking about, why do you think a student should apply to grad school?
That's an interesting question. And I'll be honest, I don't think I've been asked that exact question. So my response will be very off the cuff. A student should apply to graduate school if they really want to become a scientist for life. I would say if that's really the career choice you want. There are careers you can choose that have science mixed in that don't require a PhD for sure. But if you really want to be dedicated to science for the entirety of your career, that's what makes it worthwhile. It's not necessarily the most lucrative, career path. I would say in chemistry specifically, it is one that lends itself to lots of career paths. There are other PhDs you might get in other sciences that are sort of lining you up to become a professor. That's like the main career track. Chemistry is a little different in that there's a whole, plethora of career options out there that require a PhD in chemistry that are not, being a professor or even being in education. So Anna's obviously a testament to that. The whole pharmaceutical sector, and there are many other sectors outside of organic chemistry that employ lots of PhD chemists. So I would just say for a PhD in science, you want to really devote your life to science on some level. For a PhD in chemistry, there are lots of career options. And I would just say that, you're not required to devote your life to science after getting a PhD. But if you're going to invest this amount of time in your life, then it should be something that you at least have your eye on at the beginning. So that's
it should be relevant to what maybe you want to do in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that was like a really well-crafted response. Not that I'm surprised, but I'm like, wow, you're really good at this. Okay,
yeah.
Cool. But that's why you're here.
Yeah, I will say I do ask students when they come to talk to me about joining my group, one of my first questions is, what do you want to do after graduate school? And so I've gotten lots of varied answers on that. And so, there are lots of reasons, but I would say it's that you're very excited about science.
I'm curious too, what do you feel like the difference is between a PhD level scientist versus a master's level scientist, and what would make a student apply to one versus the other?
That's also a really good question. If you look at employability, and this is ad hoc, this is not based on like a bunch of data I've gathered. This is based on like the number of emails I get from people looking to fill positions. A master's level scientist is sort of the hottest commodity. That's the one of the career level, education levels that is really sought after, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. And it's ironic because there aren't very many master-specific programs in organic chemistry in the United States. Bachelors are the next one down, and PhDs sometimes face the toughest job market. That it can be very competitive to get a job at PhD level. So that would almost argue, that there might be a genuine advantage to one or the other. But you asked about the difference. I would just say that a master's level scientist can expect to spend most of their career actually working in a laboratory, probably. That is from my experience from seeing people leave my lab and get jobs. You can take on a supervisorial role. You can, there are all kinds of great career advancement options, but you will likely spend more time in an actual laboratory on a master's with a master's degree at a pharmaceutical company. And that's going to be my main basis of comparison because that's where I worked and where a lot of my students have gone.
Yeah.
PhD level, there's often a career track of passing through the laboratory. You are definitely in the laboratory for quite a while, but I noticed the PhD students that have left my group eventually are taking on more of a supervisorial role. Some of them go back and get an MBA and become, the CEO of a company. Some of them take on more of a leadership role within the company, or even a different role. And even the ones who stay, say, in a process group, they get to the point where they're not actually going into the laboratory to run very many experiments. They're overseeing a team that's doing a lot of that. And, there are plus and minus to that. Some people look forward to not having to deal with stinky chemicals ever again. Some people miss actually running experiments and having to pretty much do paperwork and supervise people and deal with personalities all day. So, there are advantages and disadvantages. So just circling back to your original question, what's the difference? That's roughly the difference I've seen.
Yeah, I would say that my own personal experience of selecting a PhD program or selecting to do a PhD program was because of, I felt like there would be a bigger variety of different jobs that would be an option for me. Like when I first started, I knew I wanted to go into industry, but I liked the idea of being able to be an academic if I wanted to at the end of my PhD experience. And so that was kind of what was guiding my thought process. And yeah, I would say like between me and Nina, like we both do very different things with our PhDs. And so I think that's also a good representation of like the diversity. I think a lot of people don't really, I think people go into their PhDs knowing that they will have a lot of options, but they don't know the specific options yet until the very end. So I think that's pretty consistent. Seems like there's like a high kind of like ceiling to what you could do with a PhD.
Actually, that's what I was going to say. The reason that I applied to get a PhD specifically was because for a master's, in some ways, there kind of is a ceiling. You can always work your way up, like Jared was saying. But I never wanted to feel like, oh, shoot, I didn't get this final boss that would allow me to get the career that I wanted. So that's why I did a postdoc too, honestly, because I was like, okay, got to check all of the boxes so I can go as far up as I want.
It seems like it's like very, it's good for the people who are like really indecisive and like who have like no idea, like, what you want to do when you're going into it. And like you're deciding to apply probably in your early 20s. So you're probably like, what? I have no idea what's going to happen in 5 years, but I want there to be as many options as possible. But if you're somebody, I feel like who conversely you can visualize like what kind of position you want to be in and what would make you happy. Like if you're really certain about that, then I feel like maybe getting a master's right off the get-go might be a good choice. Because all of the people I know who do have a master's did kind of have a better understanding of what kind of job they wanted, and maybe felt more decisive about what kind of job they wanted before they made that decision. So that's kind of my rough
That's so true.
estimate.
But then there's people who also decided to get PhDs afterwards. But anyway, you're applying to grad school. How do you decide what schools to apply to? Or what do you think a student should think about?
This is an excellent question. And it's one of the most important because it's going to sort of set the trajectory for the rest of the grad school application process. I did undergrad research for Clayton Hethcock at UC Berkeley. And when I asked him about applying to schools, he said, you should apply to around 8 schools. That was just the number he came up with. And so at that time, there wasn't a really good way to find out information about schools. There was like this ACS directory that was pre-websites, pretty much. Um, so I made a list of a bunch of programs. I went and talked to him, and he said, yes to these few, no to these ones that you've mentioned here for the following reasons, and you might want to consider adding these two. And so I had that, sort of back and forth, and then I settled on schools to apply to. And then I applied to those schools. And then actually I had a sort of imposter syndrome moment where suddenly I was panicking that I was not going to get into any of the schools I applied to because I don't know, it was just the whole process was overwhelming to me. And so I went and talked to him and I said, Clayton, should I apply to some other schools just to like at the lower end to make sure I get into at least one graduate school? And he said, no, I think you're going to get into about half the schools you applied to. And then I got into 4 of those schools.
Nice.
Now, I tell this story for the following reason. You want to apply to, I would say, between 8 and 12 schools. And you want to try to get into a third to a half of them, depending on the number. Now, you might be saying, how can I possibly know what schools I'm going to get into or how many I'm going to get into? The hope is that you have someone to talk to about this. So if you have the luxury, again, of being at an R1 school with a large chemistry program and you're doing undergrad research in a PhD granting PI's group, they're going to have very good perspective on this. And they will have been on the admissions committee. And they can look at your list of schools and they can already picture you getting into some, maybe not getting to others. And they can sort of picture the range that you've established. So I've gotten pretty good at this in reviewing lists of schools with students. But how do you even get to the point that you have that list? So, I'm already talking about this list, but where does that list come from? The list comes from many sources. I would say, again, if you're in a research group where you can talk to other grad students, like where else did you apply? What are some good schools to apply to? If you want to do organic chemistry, there's this convenient list of every PI who is working at a PhD granting institution called Organic Links. It used to be called Organic Links. I think it's Synthetic Organic Faculty. It's on the ACS website. There are about 650 links there. It's a whole effort that I've been involved in, and I've found it useful for multiple decades. And so you can go through there and just look and say, like, if you go through, you can sort of get a sense of if a school has, 6 organic chemistry faculty listed on that website, that's going to be a program you want to think about. If it's got 1, that's a program, probably a bad idea. It might be a really spectacular graduate program for other things, for physical chemistry or for, chemical biology or for like other things that you aren't going to be interested in. So number of faculty is sort of a gauge there. School reputation is a gauge, but not a very good one. I would say that there are some schools that don't have really great academic reputations in, say, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but they have a really spectacular chemistry program, or maybe they have a okay chemistry program for graduate students, but they're really strong in organic chemistry. So that actually, I can picture a couple schools that fall into that category. And again, there are some schools that are white hot in U.S. News and World Report. Okay, they've got an awesome reputation. My favorite example used to be Harvard. This is not really true anymore, but back in the day, Harvard was very strong for organic chemistry, but they had a single faculty member doing inorganic chemistry. So to be honest, at that exact moment in time, Harvard was not a great program if you wanted to do inorganic chemistry. There were other ones that were less attractive. So I would say
more attractive.
There were other ones that were like a less attractive looking school with a more attractive graduate program in organic chemistry.
Okay.
Yes, that's what I meant. Yes. Yeah. So I would say picking schools involves, 1, just sort of doing your own level of research, going and clicking on programs, Organic Links or Synthetic Organic Faculty if you want to do organic chemistry, or there are probably other resources. We used to have ChemBio Links. It's sort of in transition at the moment and not accessible, but I used to recommend it. There are other sort of sites that aggregate things. You then just want to try and talk to students who have gone to graduate school, if you have the luxury of doing so. And then definitely talk to professors, like, walk into your organic chemistry professor. And it doesn't matter what school you're at, even if you're at a school that doesn't have a big PhD program, the person who taught you chemistry probably got a PhD in chemistry and probably has some perspective on this. And they could say, you know what, the following 6 schools are awesome. And there's no perfect way to do this. The other thing I like to mention to students is that location does sort of matter. If you are a person who was born and raised in a big city and then went to college in a big city, and you love the idea of city life and the idea of being in the middle, in a small college town where there's 200 miles of cornfields, surrounding you, sounds hideous. Well, then don't apply to that school, even if it's a great school. You may not be happy there just based on your personal life experience. Flip side, if you really like the idea of having access to natural areas and national forest and outdoor activities and mountain biking and everything like that, well, there are some schools that are going to be less attractive on that level. But in general, try to be as flexible as possible. It's not a long time that you're going to be there. Wherever it is you want to live for the rest of your life will still be there when you're done with graduate school. If you were born and raised in California and are fixated on going to California schools, California will still be here when you're done with your PhD in another state. So location sort of matters. I would say the number one thing that matters is whether or not there are lots of PIs doing what you want to do in graduate school. There should be at least 3 there that you could picture yourself working for. And sometimes that is a little bit inexact. One of those people might still be on the website, even though they retired a year ago. So you sometimes have to dig a little deeper. But you want to make sure that it's a program that you like the look of. I would say that the number of PIs doing the area of science that you want to do is at least 3. Location matters a little bit. School reputation doesn't really matter if the program's good and the PIs are good. You can also base on, your this is a sort of fuzzier thing that I think has come up in recent decades and maybe wasn't a factor when I applied to grad school. Well, it wasn't a factor for me because I'm a cisgendered white dude, right? I don't have to find that unique environment that I'm going to feel comfortable in. Right. If you see a school, if you're LGBTQ, and you see a school that has gone out of their way to say this is something we support and embrace, and you notice this on multiple people's website, and you notice there are PIs there that are mentioned in the Pride issue of CNE News, like those factors can absolutely contribute to whether or not you apply to school. Another school might make none of that effort, and it doesn't mean they're unwelcoming, but it may just not mean that they give you the vibe you want in your PhD, and that does matter. If you're miserable if you're doing great science in a wonderful PIs group, but the environment around you is not making you happy, that can detract from your grad school experience. So I would just say that these are all things to consider.
Yeah, definitely.
You need a good sense of when you're choosing a program, on one hand, there's the research component of it, because you are going to get your degree and to get research done. But on the other hand, it's going to be a significant chunk of your life in possibly a new environment. You're maybe not doing it very close to home.
Yeah.
And it's with anything in life, you need to know whether or not you would be able to have access to a support system there that, even outside of your research, a community of people that you can rely on and depend on. I mean, that was a big factor for me because I had to move really far for grad school. I moved all the way to California. I didn't know anybody in Davis. Whereas Nina, on the other hand, had an aunt, 2 aunts.
My aunt lived in Davis. My other aunt lived in Sacramento. Yeah.
So I feel she and I probably...
My cousin was also going to UC Davis too. Yeah.
That's right. Because the Californians all know each other. It's the Californians just stay together.
It's my family.
Know. It's true. But I didn't have that. So but I had to think about, when I got there, thankfully I was able to cultivate that and build that. And it was a good environment for that, but I didn't think about that enough when I made the move. I was just I'm moving.
Well, also I would say that if you get into say 3 or 4 schools, which is great, and you visit all 3 or 4 of them, that's the real time to just ask yourself whether or not it's the environment you want.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I would say, is also, again, just sort of the inexact science of graduate school. I visited 4 different schools, and they all made a pretty positive impression on me, but I just sort of, when I visited the last one, which is where I ended up going, I just ended up having a very positive impression. I was like, this is it. I'm not even considering the other schools. Now I definitely know where I want to go. And I always hope for students to have that moment that they get into multiple schools, they visit those schools, and then there's something about that program. It's either the location, hopefully it's a combination of the location, the graduate students they interact with, giving them that sense that I want to be one of these people. I want to be part of this community, and visiting with a PI who inspires them, really makes them feel like, wow, I want to work for this person. And I always caution people, the PI can sound really good in that one-on-one meeting. So it has to be a combination of what that PI is saying, and it has to align with what the students are saying about that PI. That's kind of like the magic combination that gives you the information you need about a group that hopefully resonates and gives you a sense that you want to go there. So I would say at the application phase, some of those things are tough to judge, but it's not like you're having to pick one school. You're picking 10 or even more.
I would say that applying to multiple schools help.
Yeah. And every year I tell certain students, if a student comes in and they've got good undergrad research experience and a 3.4 GPA, which is good, it's better than mine was as an undergraduate, I will tell them something along the lines of, it's okay if you apply to Harvard and MIT and Princeton and Stanford. You have a very low probability of getting into those schools. So I don't want to crush your dreams by telling you not to apply there. But when we're talking about this number, those schools don't count for that number. Okay.
Right.
The number has to be the range of schools that I or others have concluded you probably have a good chance of getting into. And I've seen it go both ways. I've had students come in with a list that's too top heavy, where I'm like, listen, you really need to apply some schools that are a little more middle of the road that you have a better chance of getting into. I have other students who are just like, lack self-confidence, and they come in and they have a publication and a 3.9 GPA and, whatever, lots of good research experience. And I'm like, you have a shot at getting in everywhere. Like, why are you not applying to these other schools? I will challenge them with that. And sometimes they have reason. They're like, well, I'm not applying to Harvard, MIT, or Princeton because I'm not leaving the West Coast. Don't ask again. I'm like, okay.
Fine. All right. Don't ask me twice. Or don't tell me twice. So we're starting this with you've made a good decision at this point as an audience member of wanting to get a PhD or wanting to go to graduate school. And so hopefully you made the smartest decision possible. Nina and I have recorded, I think, some episodes already that touch upon what goes into this decision-making process. But given all of that being true, now you're sitting down, you're thinking about applying. And one thing that I really liked, so Jared is both our research advisor, but in our graduate programs, he's also taught a number of our graduate courses. I say a number, but I think it's probably one. And I'm sorry if that's the case. So we've had I would say in summary, Nina and I have experiences learning through taking a class that Jared is teaching. We've also TA'd for you. I think part of the reason why we wanted to invite you to do this is because I feel like you are a great teacher. And not everybody in academia is good at teaching, but I think you're very good at summarizing points and getting kind of the take-home message across really well. So I think that's going to contribute a lot. And one of my favorite teaching techniques that you have is you break things down into kind of 3 main categories. And I like that because that's how I wanted to set this up. So, there are all these different components to a graduate school application. And I think it would be a really worthwhile use of our time if you kind of went through what would be the most important you need to have these components of your application to even be considered. What are the things that are, these kind of matter, they contribute, but they're not vital to your application. And then maybe at the very end, we cover things that really don't matter much at all. You can include them, but they're not going to really make or break your application. So maybe starting there.
Yeah. So I would just say at the outset of your application, one thing that does matter is your GPA. And I'll just touch on that briefly. Yeah, your GPA matters because in many programs, there's a sort of a floor. I think in our program, it's a 3.0 GPA. And it's not that you can't be admitted if you have below that GPA. It's just that there's extra paperwork for the admissions committee to do to create an exception. For students who have come to me that really want to go to graduate school, and let's say they've done undergrad research and they have other qualifications, they seem really great, but their GPA is just, quite a bit below 3.0. I recommend they go get a master's. That's a really great track, is to go to Cal State Long Beach, for instance. You two overlapped with a grad student in our program who used to come to our group meetings, who was in this exact category. And he came back and attended graduate school and did extraordinarily well, in spite of having a GPA below 3.0. So what I'm saying is, if your GPA is below 3.0, don't despair. It's just you might be on a little different track than some of your classmates. So your GPA does matter. It also matters in that some schools are going to put it in a spreadsheet and sort it numerically and just cut off and not look at below a certain number just to reduce the number of applications. The unfortunate thing there is that GPA is a notoriously inexact measure of a person's knowledge. So I don't want to talk too much more about GPA. The number one component, I would say, is undergraduate research experience. You have to have that in order to go to a competitive PhD program. And you also just have to have a satisfying experience once you get there. So it's a requirement for admission, and I would say it's a requirement for actually enjoying the process. And I'll mention this probably several times. You're going to have to enjoy the process. So a PhD in chemistry is not law school or med school. Okay, law school or med school, you sort of can muscle through it because there's this exact endpoint and a career that you're going to get when you get that diploma. A PhD is a little different. It's fuzzier in when it ends. The level of accomplishment isn't as well defined as, say, your GPA in law school, and the career endpoint, as we've discussed previously, is not as clear. So you're going to want to enjoy the process while you're there as much as possible. So I would say
doing it every day. So
yeah,
especially
exactly.
if it's in science. So yeah, think about you doing. This is why undergraduate research experience is really important. Just to add on to this is like whatever you're doing in your undergraduate research experience, if you're trying to do something similar to that, it's going to give you a flavor of like what kinds of techniques, like what your day is going to look like every day in grad school for 5 years. So being realistic about,
at least,
am I going to enjoy doing this?
Right.
And am I going to enjoy doing this for 5 years is a good place to start.
Absolutely. And if you have the luxury of being at an institution with a large PhD program in chemistry, you'll actually get to know quite a few graduate students as an undergraduate researcher, and you'll meet people who are not terribly happy in their PhD, and you can sort of maybe find out why aren't they enjoying their PhD? Why are you not liking graduate school right now? You'll also meet people that are just super enthusiastic. They're in all the time. They're just driven and really enjoying the process. And you might decide, wow, this person's having the experience I want to have, and this is motivating me to go to grad school.
I'm curious, in the same context of undergraduate research, is there an expectation for them to have published? Or is that, because I feel like as time goes on, the requirements are getting harder and harder, and it almost seems like it is required.
So I'll address 2 points you've raised there. I would say there's no expectation to have published. And I would say in my own research group experience, there's a lag in publication time. And sometimes it just can't be crammed in before December 1st of the fourth year of a graduate student. And so even if a student is very productive and has made great contributions to a project, the chances of that actually being in print before December 1st are, and that's the standard deadline now. The deadlines now have all gotten pretty early. They're all pretty much December 1st. Makes it unlikely. I will say that it adds a lot to an application. So sometimes if in a world where people want to spreadsheet things to make data easy to analyze, when you have 300 applications in front of you and you're going to only admit maybe a quarter tops, you have to have a way to sort of narrow things down. And one way is to prioritize people that have publications. Again, it's inexact. Just because a person's name is on a publication, it doesn't make them night and day different from someone who's not, just like a good GPA. But it is a factor that sort of adds strength to an application. You mentioned grad school getting harder and harder to get into. I would say that I would not have really agreed with that statement until the last 2 years. And We don't have to talk a lot about the politics behind grad student unionization and other things, but the fact of the matter is that has driven up the cost of a graduate student significantly and quickly. So it has been gradually getting more expensive for graduate students, but it went
for the PI, right? It's
for
more
the-
expensive for the PI to take on a graduate student.
It's the PI and the program. Okay, so
Right.
right now the TA salary, our department gets a budget to conduct our teaching activities, and there's a certain number of dollars allocated for TA positions, and TA salaries just went up significantly. And furthermore, depending on the years of experience you have, the TA salary can be extremely high. In fact, the 50% TA salary, if you double it, it's higher than some professors are making at UC Davis. That's how significantly it went up. So, and again, let's save that for another podcast, because I think that's a whole ecosystem of activities that has really had an impact on people's lives in ways that maybe some students didn't anticipate before it happened. But again, getting back to the point here, is programs immediately panicked on the cost, that, whether or not they were going to have the money on hand to pay for this number of TAs and for the number of GSRs, however that gets paid. It's largely through grants. It's also through other mechanisms. And so the number of students accepted in any program has gone down, I would say, I won't say dramatically, but noticeably in the last couple of years. I will say I wrote a letter of rec for a student who was very strong on all levels. And we discussed the schools they were going to apply to, which maybe we'll discuss later in this episode. And I was surprised at the low number they got into. It was very different than every previous year. I was sort of picturing this student 5 years ago would have gotten into more programs.
Cool. Yeah. I think that maybe towards the end we can circle back to kind of like these contextual reasons for graduate admissions decisions, because that sometimes is independent of like, how good your application you might have. Like you might have all the necessary application components, and, whether or not you ultimately make the cut is dependent on a lot of factors that are maybe even outside of, how qualified you are.
Yeah. And actually this is a great point, what you've just raised and what what Nina brought up a minute ago about getting more difficult to get into. One thing that is kind of strange with grad school admissions that sets it apart from undergrad admissions is it's a small number of students that are being admitted to a program. And there are lots of factors. So for instance, if a department just recently hired 2 new organic faculty members, and they know that they're going to want to take lots of students into their group, they might sort of adjust the number of organic students they admit that year. And remember that we can't actually control the number of students that show up in the fall. All we can control is the number we admit. And so that's also very inexact. So then if you admit a large number of organic students one year, this is the sort of parallel thing that can happen. And let's say the following year, 2 organic faculty members retire. Another one just lost their major grant funding and haven't been able to get it renewed. And another one got recruited to another school. Suddenly, the number of organic students that program wants to admit that year might plummet dramatically from previous years. And so it might suddenly become a lot harder to get into that program than it was 5 years previously with the exact same application. So it is really, when a student applies to grad school, their experience is unique to that year. Another student a year later with their same qualifications might either get accepted or get denied from the same programs.
Obviously, this isn't stuff that like I knew. I certainly wasn't aware of this ahead of time. Like, I feel like you'd have to be like so ears to the ground to kind of make those types of inferences. Like, you'd have to have like a good network of people who knew kind of the inner workings of that particular department and the hiring and the and the movement of the faculty members to even like consider that. So I would say for the average, like, if you're applying for grad school, don't worry about that too much. Like, understand that might be happening behind the scenes, but you're applying to probably a lot of schools. And so keeping track of all of that's unnecessary and it's not going to help you.
It is unnecessary. And it also, these things can happen once you get there. There can be changes within a program. People can leave, a year or 2 in. And that may or may not impact your experience at that particular school.
Yeah.
So I would say, based on the need for undergraduate research, one of the most important components of your application is the letter of recommendation from someone with whom you have done research. So that letter is more important than, say, someone whose class you aced. And that letter should come from hopefully from a professor or the PI of a laboratory, the principal investigator. I'm sure that's a term your listeners have encountered in your podcast.
But it's good to define anyway.
And often the PI will write the letter with input from a graduate student or a postdoc or whoever might be directly supervising the undergraduate researcher. When I wrote letters for students who worked with graduate students in my group, and I might have done this I'm trying to remember if I did this for both of you or at least for Nina, I would say, send me a paragraph about this student. And I would write my own thoughts on the student. And then I would say, I didn't work with a student on a day-to-day basis, but this student did. And here's what they had to say. And I would put that in unedited, just as like a quote.
Oh, really? I didn't know it was unedited. That's good to know.
Maybe I should tell people. Maybe I should warn people.
Yeah.
I mean, I would, if there was some rambling sentence about the student doing something, not having nothing to do with the lab, I might cut something, but I wouldn't like alter the text. I generally would just cut and paste it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very unique too. I think that process makes sense for big labs, especially where like, you're paired as an undergraduate researcher, you're usually working more with a graduate student than you are with like, let's say a faculty member or a PI in the lab. And, but the moral of the story is you want there to be content from someone who really knows the way that you're working, whether that is the PI or the graduate student, whoever it is that you've worked very closely with and can vouch for your, technical research skills. That's the best person to have.
Yeah. And I think also the postdoc or grad student or whoever is supervising an undergrad researcher can comment on their sort of technical skill or their work ethic or their overall, small things. The PI, who has written 100 of these letters, can sort of put it in context and, say things like,
That's
this is one of the best students I've seen in 10 years. Can add, layers that make it sound, as convincing as possible. This is going to be a student who knows what they're getting into to go to graduate school. On the flip side, when I'm reading letters of recommendation, the things I want to see are this person is skilled in laboratory. This person, and this can be said a bunch of different ways, sort of knows what they're getting into, knows what the grad school experience is going to be like, is ready, emotionally or whatever else for this experience. I want to get that flavor, even though most people won't say that outright in a sentence. And then I want to hear that they get along with people. I really genuinely want to hear like, this is a pleasant person to have in a laboratory space full of 6 other investigators, and again, most letter writers aren't going to say the opposite. Okay. But some might not take the time to say that outright. So those are the things that I want to read in a letter or that I try to include in a letter. And just again, circling back, it's this letter from someone you've done research with that is one of the most important components of your graduate school application.
Would you say like the overarching impression that you're getting from an admissions committee kind of person is like, how much of it is this person is going, if we take this person to our program, they're not just going to quit in a year or two. Like, is that kind of an overarching consideration that you guys are thinking about when you're reviewing all the application materials?
I wouldn't say we ever discuss it in those terms, but we definitely discuss, is this person prepared for graduate school?
Okay.
That's the big question.
Got
and
it.
Sometimes that just has to be inferred from a lot of other, data points that are in the application.
So in context of rec letters, how early should students actually ask professors for them?
That's an excellent question. I think at least a month ahead of time, preferably 2 months ahead of time, and 3 or 4 months ahead of time is just fine. The other thing you want to do is you want to make life as easy as possible for your letter writer. So make a spreadsheet, list the schools you're going to apply to, list the application due dates, and include links in as one of the fields so that I can just the PI can just click and go to that link to write the rec letter. Many times when you go to apply to a school, the web-based application will trigger an email to the letter writer saying, hi, you've been invited to send a letter. So often I'm just searching email for a student's name. 10 emails come up from 10 different schools and I follow all the links. But having that spreadsheet off to the side lets me sort of look and see what I need to get done. And again, makes it as easy as possible for me to get things done. I always tell students also, you're responsible for getting your letters out the door. Do not assume that the letter writer has gotten it done or is paying attention. 1 year I had 10 students asking me for letters, and each one was applying to 10 schools. That was 100 letters to get out. So obviously it's not 100 individually crafted letters. We all know how this works. I write one letter and I customize it for the different schools. But it was 100 links to follow. It was 100 other little things to do.
Well, and they ask you so many, it's one of those things, it's like applying for jobs in the modern age where they're like, send your resume, but then also fill out everything that you put in your resume in these separate text box as well, which is super annoying as somebody who's had to do it only a couple times.
For chem grad schools, it's a whole spectrum. On some, it's like, click here to upload the letter, hit send, done. Okay. For others, it's like a brief survey of UC Davis asks one question: how would you rate this student overall? Basically a 1 to 5 scale. 5 is exceptional, 4 is outstanding, 3 is good, 2 is below average, and 1 is do not admit or something. I don't know what it is, but it's a 1 question on a 5-point scale, and it just gives a little bit of context in addition to the letter. Other schools, and I don't want to name them, but I dread them every year. As soon as I see the email come up, I'm like, oh.
Because you know how long it's going to take. Oh
yeah, and it's like so detailed, and it's for things that most letter writers aren't able to evaluate.
Yeah.
And I just have to wonder if it's it's blanket for the whole school maybe, and every grad program has to use it. But circling back to the rec letters, ask multiple months ahead of time. I tell students, send monthly reminders when there are multiple months left. When you're down to less than a month left, send a weekly reminder to that PI and make it polite. Don't be annoying. But I always tell students I enjoy getting those reminders because it sort of keeps me on my toes. And then when there's less than a week left, if a PI is really pushing it up to the deadline, send a daily reminder. I have students who are like, oh, but I really don't want to be annoying. And it's like, well, I understand that, but you suffer consequences if these letters don't go out. And if the PI has 100 of them get out, they're doing their best, but sometimes they need reminders. Now, other PIs might be different. They might say, I'm on top of this, don't send me any reminders. But and I would say that the grad school letter deadlines are kind of soft. Your application's due on December 1st. It's okay if your rec letters trickle in a week later. Don't worry too much about it. If your PI is like, hey, I had a grant deadline and I had other things to deal with and I didn't quite get your letter done on the deadline, I'll have it done over the weekend. Then take their word for it, and your application's not sunk. It's totally fine. I will say the flip side of that is that programs now they can admit you before the deadline. Okay, so if all your stuff is in early and your letters are in early and they really like the look of you, they might pull the trigger to try and really jump on recruiting you sooner. So I personally tell students, get all your other stuff in early. Don't treat that deadline as the day that you hit send. Subtract a week. Okay, maybe get it all done when you're on Thanksgiving break or something like that. If you have Thanksgiving break, I know some students may need to work. There are all kinds of things like that.
Well, I didn't know that, so that's good to know. Wish I knew that.
Well, good to know. You've already done it, dude.
I know. I'm just saying. It's good to know. Well, I mean, I can give advice to other people who apply to grad school.
Well, I also just throw in there. There are some application deadlines that are quite strict. So if you're applying for the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, which some students do prior to going to graduate school, some do while they're in graduate school, some do both. That deadline is strict. So I had a student in the group who was applying for the NSF. One of their letter writers did not get the letter in by the deadline, and their application got denied. Just didn't even get reviewed. They found out 6 months later, they're like, hi, we're not even looking at your NSF application because one of your letter writers didn't get their letter in on time.
Oh,
Very
honestly, I
sad.
would have just don't tell them. Just don't. That's so
Yeah.
sad.
I mean, that same program, there was they have strict font requirements for the size of font and spacing and margins, which is
Oh
totally
yeah.
legit. You don't want students sort of working the system by cramming in more text and whatever. You don't want anyone doing that. And so um, a student got their application bounced by having the wrong font.
Wow.
That's how it works with fellowships. Like,
Totally. That's
that's
how it works
just
with
how it
grant
works.
applications. You know, when
Yeah,
I applied to the
exactly.
NIH for $1 million,
Exactly.
there are guidelines, there are rules to follow, and those rules apply. So
If there's anything that they can easily say no, they're just going to say no.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great.
So just to circle back, ask letter writers at least 3 months in advance. Make their life easy with a spreadsheet. Email the spreadsheet. Don't send a link to a Google sheet. Okay, I'll just be honest. Having that actual document, not having to log into Google and follow a link, which I understand. Young people are just like, they have a little Google brain chip. They're logged in the entire time. They don't even know.
Wait, that's so funny because I would hate if somebody sent me a hard spreadsheet, like a local spreadsheet. You know,
I had a student in a class send me a link to something, and I said, "Can you actually send that as an attachment?" And they're like,
I hate attachments.
"No, they didn't even know what I was saying." They're like, "What do you exactly mean by attachment?" And I'm like, "When you send an email, there can be a file that comes along with the email, not just a link to somewhere to go get the file." And they were like,
Oh my God.
"Really?" So
That's so funny.
it was so weird explaining that, but it's like anything else. So yeah, and also then, do what is necessary to get those letters in on time by reminding people, but don't panic if the letter is a couple of days late.
Yeah. Would you recommend maybe like asking the professor whether they want reminders or not?
That's an excellent thing to ask. Say, do you want me to send reminders or not? I personally,
Communication.
I ask for those reminders.
I would too. It's when things are on my to-do list, it's still good to get like a little push.
I think for me, it's also just a mindset. By asking for those reminders, it puts me in the mindset that I don't actually need them. Like, it's like that's me reminding myself to get this thing done already. So I don't often need that last daily reminder the night before the things are due. I've usually have it done by then, but it's fine.
I don't know. I was just going to say, like, honestly, like, I feel like it's always good to ask because the people you're talking to already have a process usually, especially if they're like professors writing your letter that they developed over time. And from what I've understood about interacting with other academics is everybody has a process. They really like their process and they don't want to deviate from that process. So you need to figure out what that process is. Because I've recently coached someone through graduate school applications. Like, you need to figure out what that process is, work with that person's process. And
do they want a link or do they want an attachment?
Yeah. Like, and I mean, I actually use it as a way to coach someone into, like, communication skills are really important in grad school and in life. So you need to start working on your communication now. Figure out how you're going to communicate what you want to communicate with these different people, because there's different groups of, people that you're usually asking for letters from. And so just consider it an exercise in writing emails. Actually, speaking of writing emails, because I know we do want to go back and talk about something else, but one thing I was curious about is how impactful, I was given this advice about emailing professors ahead of time before applying. How impactful do you think that is, Jared? Like, what was your kind of take on emailing people, that you're thinking about joining their labs that early prior to your application process? Is it impactful? Is it not impactful?
It's impactful, I would say, when there is a goal to that email and and some sort of connection that makes it feel like you're interested in that exact person. If it feels at all like a cut and paste email that you're sending out to 100 people, I often don't even respond to it. I'll just delete it.
Really? Oh my gosh. Well, you get so many. We've talked about this.
I'm sure he gets a lot. Yeah.
I get a lot from international students, and it is, I think they are probably going through the process that might be relevant at other schools. But I will sometimes if I have time, I'll reply and say, "Hi, you actually apply to a program, not a PI. And once after you're admitted, I'd be happy to meet with you." You won't actually pick a PI until you've been in your first quarter, first semester at a program. So it's almost as if they want me to commit to accepting them in the group as of that email. So if I read that, I'm like, no, like apply to the program and I'll talk to you later. On the other hand, if I got an email recently from someone who lives locally, they live in the Bay Area, they're working at a company. They somehow heard about me from I don't know where, and they want to meet to talk to me about research. And they've included like sort of some, like either a resume or something. Um, so I would say if the student stands out as someone I might want to recruit to the group at that stage, which is difficult, which they have to stand out, and there has to be some reason for me to want to invest more time in this particular person. And I can't put my finger on what that is. But like I said, if they are local and they're saying, hey, I'd like to come visit UC Davis, can I come to your group meeting? My answer is almost always yes, you can come to a group meeting, and I'll set aside half an hour to meet with you for sure. If the student is just looking for me to sort of commit to taking them in the group before they even apply to the program, which used to be a strategy people would have, I'm often replying with, look, apply to the program, and I'm, be sure to put me on the list of people you want to meet with for the campus visit. So I would say emailing people ahead of time can be helpful. It absolutely can't hurt anything. But just expect a variety of responses. Some people might not reply, and that doesn't mean they're being obnoxious or they're not interested. It just means that was one of several dozen emails they didn't have time to write a substantive response to. And the fact of the matter is, you have to apply to that program and be admitted before they have any influence over whether you're going to be in the group. So it's not really of any real consequence most of the time. So,
and it requires a lot of planning, which I feel like we're already, I don't know. I felt like I had like a year to plan out my graduate school application, but even towards the end, I was still like scrambling for some reason. Yeah. And I say this because there were several people, I didn't have enough time to I didn't get around to emailing these people that I was interested in on my respective programs until it was like maybe October, November. And by the time they got back to me, the most impactful thing out of that experience is there were professors that literally were like, I'm not taking students, I'm retiring. And there was no way, or they will be honest with me and they'll say, I just don't see myself having the funding for students this year. So, don't. And that was impactful because it did kind of persuade. I wish I would have made changes to my research summary, because in my research summary, I would usually say, I think my background would make me particularly successful at pursuing this type of research with this PI at that school. And if that person was no longer taking students, I was like, well, I just wasted a bunch of space in my research, statement. So yeah.
Yeah. So I would say those emails are, they can be helpful. If a student chooses not to send one of those emails before applying to graduate school, that's totally fine. Yeah. If a student chooses to invest a lot of time doing that, they may or may not get results from that are helpful. But if they do, that's fine.
Well, actually, one more thing for this section, right? So we're talking about requirements. So what about the GRE?
The GRE is an interesting one. I used to talk about it a bit when I would give talks on getting into graduate school. The GRE has become only sort of relevant now. So many programs have gotten rid of it. It was a great tool because it was sort of consistent year to year. And it also was numerical. Again, it was something you could put in a spreadsheet and sort, in descending numerical order, and then just not consider students below a certain GRE score if you felt like doing that kind of thing. I think it was just recognized over time that it just wasn't a good measure. I never thought, so I always ignored GRE scores when I looked at graduate applications because I did not think it was a good measure of someone's preparedness for graduate school. That was my bottom line. I didn't do particularly well in the GRE. I remember taking the Chem GRE and seeing questions asked that involved things I'd never even heard of. I was like, what? Mm-hmm. So I just, based on my own experience and based on seeing students, come and go from graduate school, I was sort of discounting the GRE long ago. On a more official level, people pointed out, it's a thing you can do well on if you are privileged, if you have plenty of time to take a prep course and money for that kind of thing. And you can take it multiple times. Like you could sort of, really do well on the GRE if you felt like it and you had the resources to do so. And, you might do poorly on it if you only have time to take it once and you don't have the time and resources to really prepare for this kind of obscure exam. So there was this whole thing on Twitter a couple of years back Grexit. I think you probably both saw that term. And there were lots of programs just getting rid of the GRE. So I would say now it's gotten to the point where a student might make a list of 10 schools they want to apply to. 9 of them don't require the GRE. 1 of them does. They're going to apply to 9 schools. And they're not going to go take the GRE for that one school. Now, if you really, really want to go to, say, Harvard, MIT, or Princeton, you're probably going to have to take the GRE. I think those programs might still require it. But I have never had a high opinion of the GRE. I always spent very little time talking about it. I was like, listen, if you have time, take a prep course, do some preparation for it, and do your best. But in reading applications, I've never thought it was terribly significant.
I mean, it's a useful perspective to have either way. Like, some people probably consider it to be more important too, but you can't really control for that. And I think it used to be in the kind of like necessary pool because you kind of needed that component to even apply to a lot of graduate programs. So now that it is optional, I would firmly place it in like sure, if you have a good score, or if you did well in it, like, why not include it? But it's not going to, I think, make or break. It won't certainly, I think, supersede like your undergraduate experience or even your GPA. So yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Any other kind of necessities to have before applying, or did we kind of cover that?
I think we've covered everything.
Okay.
You will need 3 letters of recommendation.
That's right.
Only one obviously is going to come from the main person you've done research for. I would say the most valuable letters are ones that comment on your ability to do research. So for instance, if you did undergrad research in a lab and you did a summer research program and you have 2 letters on that front, then that's great. Use both of those. If you only have 1, that's kind of normal. Your next 2 letters can come from one of 2 individuals. I'd say either a chemistry class you did well in, or someone commenting on your ability to do something related to chemistry. So I've seen letters from, say, a lab, an undergraduate lab dispensary where an undergrad got a job working there. And so you're still dealing with chemistry on some level. That person might comment more on your work ethic, your how pleasant you were to be around, whether or not you showed up on time, things like that. I would say that don't necessarily go for letter writers in a class you did really well in that's not a chemistry class. So you might have really done extraordinarily well in your upper division writing class that you took. That's not terribly relevant to science graduate school. And so they can write you a glowing letter and it won't carry a lot of weight.
So don't ask for a letter of recommendation from your underwater basket weaving class at Berkeley.
Definitely
is
not.
The moral of the story.
I'm curious actually, because I've had several people ask me to write letters for them. And that's because I taught the Chem 131. Which is an upper division synthesis class, but I co-wrote it basically with you, Jared, where you signed off on the letter to say, hey, okay, I'm validating this. But then I had people continue to ask me for letters when I was a postdoc. And I'm curious what admissions committees think of postdocs or academic people, but who still taught the class or worked with the students. Like, what admissions committees think of people like that.
Yeah, those are still good letters to have for sure in support of your application. And also, if you worked at a company for the summer, getting a letter from that, the person you worked for at that company is completely fine. I wasn't trying to say that you have to be in academics.
Sure, yeah.
It's letters tend to carry more weight, the more senior person they come from. Mm-hmm. So certainly if a PI is willing to co-sign a letter, I will, like I said, I do the paragraph thing even when a student is just in a class. If I had a student who's in Chem 131, this upper division organic class, and they're doing undergrad research for one of my colleagues and they want to apply to graduate school, I will sometimes ask a TA, did you interact with the student a lot? And if you did, and it just adds more, instead of me writing a 1-paragraph letter saying this person did well in exams and I talked to them in office hours twice, it can be, more of a 1.5-page letter with more context and more information. Mm-hmm. So these are all good strategies.
I don't know, maybe this is a dumb question, but it's like, do you think 3 is just an arbitrary, this is just an aside, but 3 letters of recommendation just feels so arbitrary because like you said, a lot of us are lucky to have 1 solid, research experience. And really if you have that, if you have a really strong research, letter of recommendation. How important are the other two? It just seems like 3 is such an arbitrary number for getting the right information.
Well, and for a while in our program, we switched to having 2 letters because it was taking so long to get all 3 letters in that there were really good candidates that would be waiting on that 3rd letter. So 3 is kind of an arbitrary number. I, love to see a kind of long substantive letter from the person supervising research. The other 2 letters, honestly, if they're a paragraph, sometimes they're like a half-page letter that's a paragraph saying this person did very well in the class and asked intelligent questions. And if there's one very substantive letter and then one letter that's kind of, this person did well in a science class, and then the 3rd letter is a little out there. It's not quite the most relevant letter, but it sort of contributes to this theme of this being a good person to bring into the program. That's fine. We probably would get all the information we need from 2 letters. So why is it 3? I don't know. It's been 3 for so long for so many programs. I will say, honestly, I've been involved in graduate admissions, since 1992, which is when I applied to graduate school. And I would just say the process has changed so little over that time that
that's when I was born.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it was 3 letters then, it's 3 letters now. You had to have undergrad research then, you have to have it now. You get admitted based on your application in chemistry, and then you go visit schools. That is mostly still true. So, just get back to your point. It's been 3 letters for a long time. It just is.
Okay. Yeah. It almost made me, like, when I was an undergraduate researcher applying, it almost made me feel like, even though really you need one strong undergraduate research letter, that I needed to kind of have 2 different lab experiences just to fill that quota for me. And that's just me being real for the class. Yeah. Like, it's not, I don't think it's necessary, but it almost was like, in my head, I was thinking to myself, I need 3 letters. Like, it would be easier if I had like 2 different lab experiences. So I was like, just be easier. I don't know if somebody's listening to this and it would be easier for them. That's one way to go about it, to fill up the 3 letters with something substantive, because I didn't want my 3rd letter to be like a really weird, like, out of the way letter. Like, my work experience was in hotels. So I was like, well, I don't know if I want to ask my hotel manager to write me a letter for grad school. That seems unnecessary. But on the other hand, it didn't seem like the academic, like the people that I took classes with, would have written me very good letters. So I didn't end up asking them for those either. So anyway, that's just an aside about number of letters. And it's good to know kind of like what is important within that letter writing, like within your letter writers, and what is kind of like, it's nice to have and doesn't need to be crazy. So focus on the one is basically focus on,
and I would say
having a good one.
There's value in a longer research experience with one person or one group.
Right.
There's also value doing 2 different things. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I would say it's more traditional to have done undergraduate research, to have one sort of experience you've had in a lab as an undergrad. I will say, though, that over time, in the time that I've been reviewing applications, everyone's gotten very open-minded about the diversity of backgrounds that students have. So I would say when I was applying to grad schools, I was told it's going to look weird if you take a year off between undergrad and grad school and you're not spending that time like working at a company or doing something that is very science focused for that year. People are going to wonder, like, what have you been up to? And I would just say that doesn't even get discussed anymore. We get applications from people who have been out of undergrad for 10 years doing a variety of different things. And if it looks like a good application for someone who's going to do well in graduate school, we accept them. We don't worry too much about it. And I will also say that we've also gotten much more open-minded about, the diversity of preparation that goes into graduate school. Back in the day when I applied, it was all a stack of paper. And so it was probably annoying to have 3 or 4 different transcripts to deal with and trying to figure out where students were. But now it's all very organized on a website, and I can click on 4 different transcripts that are from, say, 3 community colleges followed by a 4-year school where someone finished up, and I can see what a student's been up to. So that also is kind of irrelevant. It really is like, where are you now? And are you ready to go to graduate school? If that's, you went to a 4-year institution and you got out in 4 years and you started doing undergrad research in the middle of your, 3rd year there, and it's at a school that has a PhD program, and you're going straight to grad school right out of college, great. If it's something very different than that, also great, as long as it looks like you're ready to do grad school. In fact, taking a little time off, honestly, I sometimes recommend it to students.
I like that too. Yeah.
I think we both did. Yeah.
Well, it's actually something that I heard first when I was pre-med is people actually said you have a better chance of getting into med school if you take time off between your undergrad and med school. Because specifically for med school, I think they were like, I don't know, maybe they wanted people who were on the older side. Like they felt like if you just came out of undergrad, like you didn't accumulate enough life experience, and they almost like that on a subconscious level or a conscious level of like you being a little older, being a bit more mature, and then making that decision. They feel like maybe it was a more informed and well-developed idea if you did that with a little bit of a gap. Obviously we went to grad school with a mixture of people who came out of undergrad and who took a few, like a year or two off, and I never felt like that really made a difference in our abilities to succeed in graduate school either. Yeah. So I think that's
I agree, sort of. I do think people who went straight out of undergrad, this is not fair, but I think there were people who burned out quicker that came straight out of undergrad than people who...
That's fair.
Like took a year or two off, because I felt like when you take that time off, you have time to think about like, yes, okay, this is what I want. You're not just jumping from school to school. But I have no real data to back that up. But that was the sense that I got.
Certainly true for me. That wouldn't
surprise me, honestly. Just I have encountered students who, when I've talked to them in graduate school and they maybe are struggling a little bit, they're like, yeah, I applied to grad school because it was what other people were doing. And I didn't have a better idea at the time. And I just felt like telling those students, like, I can't go back in time and give you this advice, but if I could, I'd be like, that is the wrong reason to apply to graduate school, is not having anything better to do or not knowing what else you want to do. Like, find out what you really want to do before you apply to graduate school, as far as like, at least having some sense of it.
Yeah. So kind of in relationship to this, one of the questions that Nina and I had discussed prior to recording this is kind of, did you notice any differences between what would be required of people who are applying to grad school domestically, or like if you're an international student? So if there are any difference in requirements if you're an international student?
Yeah, there are some programs where they limit the number of international students that can come in because there's some additional cost for an international student. And so I know in our program, there used to be like a cap. It's like, you can admit this number of international students, and beyond that, you have to pay the non-resident tuition out of your own budget. And so that was just an incentive not to take very many international students. But that's gone away. And so there's no restriction on the number of international students we can take. It's different because many international students can't come visit ahead of time. And, and I would say that the pandemic did change things fundamentally in that it made remote, interviews, if you want to do interviews, much kind of barrierless. Depending on country of origin, language is a question. Does this person have the English language skills to get an education in the U.S., but also, more bluntly, TA a class? Like, most graduate students are going to work as TAs at some point in their career. And so, again, there's the test of English as a foreign language, TOEFL, which is helpful. But again, you can sort of take prep courses, do very well in TOEFL, and still not have day-to-day like practical English skills. So now a lot of times students are interviewed by Zoom as part of the application process to sort of gauge their English proficiency.
That seems like a much better, I feel like that's a good measure. Like, if you get to a point, I know it's not always practical to interview every international student by Zoom, but that's probably a better representation of their conversational English than just a standardized test. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think every program's had the experience of admitting students have a great TOEFL score, and then they get here and they're having trouble. And then other students don't do very well on TOEFL, and they get here and they're totally fine. So that's sort of equalized those things. The other thing is, during the pandemic, we had to have, virtual campus visitation. And so programs got very creative with what they could do over Zoom to try and recreate this experience of visiting grad school to get a feel for it before you come here. And so we actually have an international, Zoom virtual visitation that we've incorporated into our recruiting. So that did not exist pre-pandemic, and it wasn't something people were trying to organize pre-pandemic, but now it's easy to do.
That's
Nice.
awesome.
Yeah, and I will just say that chemistry, again, there are cultural differences between programs. Chemistry, you're applying to a program, not a specific PI, and you are admitted based on your application, and then you are hosted on a recruiting trip to try and get you to come to that school. In many biology programs, you are advanced to the level of an interview based on your application, and then you interview, and then after interviewing, you may or may not be admitted, and after that, you might visit.
That's like UCSF.
Yeah. So there are other programs too where you actually apply to a PI. You basically just send a letter to an individual PI in a PhD granting place, like in a geology department. And you say, hi, Professor Howard, I would really like to pursue a PhD with you. And then that PI can actually accept or reject you as a student on the spot. And with that acceptance, they have to provide the grant code that's going to pay that student as a GSR for the next 4 years. So it's basically just comes down to if a PI can afford to pay a student, they can admit them and have them as a PhD student. That's it. So there's a lot of variability between for how this works. So I would just say that getting back to international versus domestic, there are some issues specific to international students. And I don't, it's always a struggle to translate GPA. We try not to obsess over GPA, but when it's, there are these countries that have these very strange scales that are, say, percentages, 0 to 100. They're not integers from 1 to 4 that are averaged based on letters and then carried out 2 decimal places. I'm trying to be a little facetious. I feel like the international system sort of makes sense and the US system makes no sense or very little.
Yep.
Yeah, you get this letter that then becomes a number, that then becomes average, and you go out 2 significant figures. Okay, it's like the error bars on that number are kind of enormous.
And there's already like huge distinctions between the way that's like already well known, like certain colleges will do GPAs and other college, so we're already like there's inconsistencies between like the way one school will do, an American school will do GPA and another American school will do GPA. So adding in the kind of international component, it's a really complicated number already, and not the best measurement, but it's all we have kind of situation.
Here's what we chose.
It's what we chose.
A B plus in a chemistry class at UC Davis in a particular professor's class means one thing. A B plus in some other professor's class on another campus at a non-state supported school, at a private school, might mean something entirely different.
Right.
And yet those get translated into the same number and looked at
on the same
closely.
Spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And organized the same way. Yeah. It's hard to, which is why I think that when we say that GPA is important, it is important because that is the reality of the situation, but there are the other components of your application as well to kind of also help support that.
The other thing for international students is that they can't be supported by, say, things like an NIH training grant.
Right.
And they're not eligible for certain fellowships like the NSF GRFP. So there are other things like that I would say make it more difficult for international students to be admitted to a particular program than the same domestic student. The other thing is there's sometimes just, it's hard to put a finger on it. It's like the familiarity, right? If I get a letter of recommendation from my former PhD advisor, Keith Warfel at NYU, that Anna Lowe's a really great student to have, and she knows what she's getting into for graduate school, that means a lot to me. When I read a letter of recommendation from an international school, and let's say I'm not familiar with that school, not familiar with that PI, not familiar with that program, I don't know anything about it, it has less impact on me as the reader of the graduate application. And that, I would just say, is part of the sort of fuzzy math that goes into admitting students, because in the end, it is really just a feeling. It's an assessment of a whole person based on a bunch of factors. it's not strictly numbers. It's not strictly number of publications, GPA, and numerical things that get counted within a recommendation letter. So because it is a relatively soft process, there are some intangibles, I would say, that go into applications that also might be unique to an international student versus domestic student.
Actually, speaking about kind of communication, kind of like setting your application apart, like something that I've always wondered about, and I think this is really interesting because the most important things for your graduate student application, like your GPA and undergraduate research experience, is almost kind of like a set it and forget it kind of experience. And I say this because like we're very used to getting we're very used to throughout the entire course of our education to want to achieve the best score like in our class or the best grade in our class. So like the GPA is kind of like, you've worked really hard for your GPA for an entire course of your life, and when I sit down and I'm applying, my GPA is set. And there's nothing I can really do to make that GPA better.
Nope.
It's just a number, it's out there, and hopefully it's like high enough to be considered.
Also, can I interrupt just briefly?
Yeah, of course.
So the other thing to keep in mind is your GPA is set at the end of your third year, okay? Because graduate applications are now due early in the fall. The only reason this matters is that if you struggled a little bit in the beginning of your undergrad experience and now you're doing really well and you're set to get straight A's your whole senior year or fourth year or last year, that's no one's ever going to know for your graduate application unless you take a year off. Okay, right. So if you take a year off, what I did. So that is a very logical reason to take a year off, I would just say. Yeah. So yes, Anna, your GPA is set. But the one way to modify it is to apply a little later so that all your grades get counted.
That's super fair. I like that. I employed as a user of that strategy. I super support it. I mean, I had the luxury of going to college close to home, so I didn't necessarily have to, pay extra money, for instance, to like take that year off by any means. Like I just kind of stayed at home and I accumulated more research experience during my year off in preparation for grad school. But yeah, I say this because when I sit down, when I sit down and I was thinking about what were the most stressful components of my graduate school application, it wasn't my undergraduate research. It didn't end up being my GPA because I had already done a level of research. Like I did some planning, right? Those things happen in advance of my application. But the things that like threw me off the most are probably the things that are not as important, which is the personal statement and the research statement. I felt like I had to writing those two documents took up most of my time when I was actually preparing my graduate school application. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about this because what is the value in those two things in the context of the graduate school admission process? Do you number one, are you getting any insight in terms of how the student is communicating? Like if they're is that what we're getting out of it? And number two, how has that changed with the rise of ChatGPT and AI in terms of, I'm sure there are students out there who are using those programs to write their applications very obviously, or maybe not so obviously. So maybe we can touch on those two things.
Yeah, I would say I've only read graduate applications one round in the sort of ChatGPT era. That would be last year. Okay. I took a break from grad admissions for probably 7 years. Part of that time I was chair. Part of that time I just sort of got moved off of the graduate admissions committee. So I would say that pre-ChatGPT, I would probably read into how well that was written. So if you had very good grammar and you had a great topic sentence for your paragraph, et cetera, that would make a positive impression. You put me in a good mood as I'm reading it.
We're laughing because this is our grant writing process with Jared, or like anytime Jared has to review something that we write, it's always like one of the feedbacks that he'll always give is like, you need to have topic sentences.
It's a better topic sentence. Well, no, and actually, independently of that, Anna and I were talking about it. I think it was Organic Reactions, and she was like, this needs a topic sentence. And I was like,
what is the topic sentence for this paragraph? What are we even saying?
So, Anna, I will just say that I got punched in the face with that feedback the first time I wrote something for my PhD advisor. It was kind of like, your paragraph has no topic sentence. It's like, it's true. And I first learned about topic sentences in, third grade, like everyone else.
Yeah. That's so funny.
So, yeah, that is definitely true. Anyway, I will worry less about that now, knowing that it is not that anyone can have a very nice sounding paragraph based on tools that are available. That the research statement, excuse me, is, and not all grad applications have the same exact documents required. Some just have a personal statement, some just have a research statement, some have both. I would say a research statement is a good time to hear what a student has to say about how their experience up to that point ties into what they want to do in the future. That's what I love to read there, that appeals to me. If it's just a recapitulation of what is already in their rec letter about what they accomplished as an undergrad researcher, that's not as helpful. It doesn't hurt. It's just I kind of just go through it. But what you want to see in a grad application is that there's sort of cohesion with the experience that a person has, why they're applying to your program, and what specific things they want to do in that program that are good. So if you really, really, really want to do inorganic chemistry, and yet you're applying to a program that has one inorganic chemistry professor, and that's going to be a tougher sell, especially if it's a department that maybe excels in other areas, has more faculty members in those areas. And there's sometimes a point at which you can, outside of the research statement, you might be able to check boxes or fill in names as the PIs you might want to work for. You want to see that all tie in. It's like and I'll just make this up based on my own background. It's like a student has inorganic chemistry undergrad research experience. They want to do inorganic chemistry in graduate school, organic chemistry in graduate school. You often have to pick a specialty at the application stage. And this is for two reasons. This is to sort your applications for who they get reviewed by, because they're not all getting reviewed by all committee members. Most applications are getting sort of binned into one of 4 or 5 or 6 bins. And then you want to see that person, if they've gone to the trouble in that research statement of mentioning specific PIs they'd want to work for in the department, that also makes it really sound like they want to come to this department for a reason. They're not just cutting and pasting 12 times on 12 different websites. So I would say those are kind of the things that can go into a research statement that I look for.
Do you think that that's a good, or I guess, are you going to talk about the personal statement next?
I was, but we can keep talking about this for a few minutes.
Well, I was just wondering, at what point or in what document should students explain anything weird about their application, or like anything, well, I guess anything that is less good about their application?
I would say that you can use both documents for that. So in the research statement, if you have 3 vastly different research experiences, you can try to tie them all together. Or you could say, yeah, I did research in 3 different laboratories, and it turns out number 3 was the one I loved the most, and it happened to be organic chemistry. And it's the least amount of time I've spent doing research, but it really made an impression on me. And now that's what I want to do in graduate school. So that's a great time to explain that. If you have personal things you want to disclose that might be relevant to your application, definitely do that in the personal statement. So I would say that personal statements, I think for some graduate programs, and I mean outside of science, that personal statement may be one of the most important parts of your application. In science, for me, I sometimes will say I've never swung an application based on what I read in the personal statement, meaning I've already decided no based on a not terribly good rec letters, not terribly good GPA, not terribly good anything looking like you're a good candidate for grad school. But then I read a really spectacular personal statement. Now I want to press yes on this person. Contrariwise, if I'm already at yes based on a really great looking application overall, and I see a kind of poorly written personal statement, I haven't generally gone to no. So I would just say the personal statement is not something you should spend a lot of time on in your application if you could use that time to make other aspects of your application stronger. What you can do in there is explain things a bit. I will say that we had an applicant a number of years back who had a GPA just below 3.0, but they were from a school that we've had great applicants from that school. We as an admissions committee, we're all familiar with that school and with the PIs that normally write letters and everything. I don't want to use the term pipeline, but sure, fine. It's a pipeline school for the UC Davis graduate program. So this applicant the GPA was kind of an outlier. It seemed odd. What we read in their personal statement, they said, I think something to the effect of a parent passing away at the end of their first year. And so they probably should have dropped out of school for their second year, but they didn't. They just tried to muscle through it, and they got horrible grades. They were eventually sort of recovered from this tragedy by their third year and getting good grades again. And that's why their GPA was low. So we then actually dug into their transcript, and we looked through the transcript before. You're just sort of glancing over it, looking at different things, and you can see high and low grades. And I might have looked at it the first time and said, oh, okay, this is a mix of high and low grades. And overall, there are enough low grades in there that we're down at the whatever 2.85 level. But having read the personal statement in this case, I went back and looked at it. We all did. And it was like high grades and then a year of low grades and then high grades again. So we could clearly see that second year was an outlier, as pointed out by the applicant. And we admitted the student. We did the extra paperwork, and they were successful in our program. So certainly the personal statement, if it's not research specific and there's something you want to tell us about you that might help us interpret your application differently, absolutely do it there. I will say, I've read there's one that sticks in my mind from a number of years back where a student was trying to explain something similar, and they're like, oh yeah, in my sophomore year, I partied too much.
Okay. They were too real on Maine.
That's awesome.
Right. But they said this, they said, I partied too much and did too many drugs, which is why my GPA is low that year. And I just felt like telling this person, you could have just said, I partied too much, okay? And we would fill in the blanks, okay? You're already being pretty real with I partied too much.
That's crazy.
We were being a little too honest that day.
Okay.
Yes. So, in the personal statement, add some context if you want to. Cool. And I said for
not that much, not that much,
not that much context. There can be too much context for sure.
Yes. Oh my gosh. It's funny.
Can you imagine if somebody just started writing their entire diary entry for they were summary?
Well, I would just go back to
that personal. Don't make it that personal. Don't make it that
and to go back to this other student who you two overlapped with, who had a poor GPA at the undergrad level and then got a master's, came back and was very successful in graduate school. That person in the personal statement also explained their low GPA, and they were a first-gen student. They moved to the U.S. From a country where English was not the main language. I think as a teenager, their family was extremely poor. So this student, upon arriving at college, was having to work full time and was just having to support their entire family as a student. And on top of that, they somehow managed to get undergrad research done. So it was a very inspiring story, and it sort of set the context of why their GPA was low during that time. And that student, I think that experience wasn't just something they survived. It really set them up once they did, they had a publication as an undergrad. That's how good they were in spite of all these things, competing with their time for their educational experience. By the time that person finished the master's degree, which was recommended to them by the PI they worked for, they really had the drive and determination to be extremely successful. So that person, I would say overall, was an added advantage to many of their classmates. And that's why this particular person was, I don't want to play favorites or speak in too many superlatives, but this was one of the best students of that class as far as their overall level of accomplishment.
So we've talked about what schools to choose. We've talked about the components of the application and what to focus on. But once you've actually completed all of that, what happens to the application? What do you guys do?
That's an excellent question. Most schools have a graduate admissions committee. And the graduate admissions committee is a sort of a Noah's Ark of the various subdisciplines of chemistry, of, 2 or 3 people who do organic chemistry, 2 or 3 people who do inorganic or analytical or whatever. And so students, you've all chosen one of these bins somehow in your application. What usually happens is your application is reviewed in detail by those folks. It's now all very convenient. it's all, ever since I've been reviewing applications, since the first time I did it in the fall of 2008, it's been a web-based experience that's very easy. So I can sort, I can look at all the applicants. I can then sort by the number that say that they're organic. And I can sort and say that I only want to look at the ones that are GPA 3.0 and above, which are going to be our highest priority candidates. That doesn't mean we're not going to look at the others. It's just that in my first pass, that's what I'm doing. And then from there, I can click on an application and I can look at all these components we've discussed. I can click on each of the letters of recommendation. I can click on multiple transcripts if they're available. I can read a personal statement. At UC Davis, I can look at the statistics. So there's only one numerical rating for each student, and that matters. The other part of the application that comes up, it's always optional, of course, is schools often collect demographic data. So it'll say, this section's optional, and you can fill in demographic data about yourself. And this is very important because this brings up another thing that you don't necessarily know about when you apply to graduate school. Your grad school application is often also your application for some internal fellowships or support mechanisms. So we had one program at UC Davis that I think we announced it on the website, but students didn't necessarily know what it meant or what the practical implications are. And what it was is based on demographic information, you might become accepted to this program, and it gave you an extra $5,000 per year on your stipend. So that's kind of a significant additional level of support. But it was based on that demographic information, and you had to fill it out. And so, if you self-identify as being from a group that's been traditionally excluded from graduate school, it doesn't necessarily change whether or not you can be admitted to that program. It may have an influence on whether or not you're considered for other very specific support mechanisms that can help you. So my personal recommendation is always self-identify in that section. It can only help you. There's no way for it to hurt you. And some people may wonder, why am I going out of my way to say this? It's based on interactions I've had with students who are from a traditionally excluded background, who specifically they've said to me, I should be accepted to this program based on my merit. I've worked very hard to get here, and I don't want to feel like I've gotten some special level of treatment simply because of my background. And I've had to tell these students specifically, don't worry about any of that. Okay. This additional level of consideration you might get is only going to impact you in a positive way. It doesn't undermine all the hard work you've done to get here. And honestly, these support mechanisms are there for a reason. Science has a long way to go to get to equity. The Organic Links website that I refer to, it's gotten better in recent years. But if you flip through it and you look at the number of people that are female identified, it is extraordinarily low. If you look at the number that are Latino based on last name, okay, which is an inexact measure of someone's status as a group member, it's extremely low. If you just look at people, you see a lot of I'll just be blunt. You see a lot of white guys, okay? You see a lot of people like me. And so, everything's moving in the right direction. There are, more people, there's a greater diversity of people involved in STEM at the undergraduate level than ever before. But the number of those that then go to graduate school, then complete a PhD, and then get a competitive postdoc, and then complete that postdoc, and then become part of the science workforce is still low. And so these mechanisms are in place to provide support and encouragement. And you should take advantage of any support or encouragement you can get that someone wants to offer. So my advice is always self-identify in that demographic section, even though it's optional.
Yeah, and you're right. I don't think a lot of people know about that. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. I think it's super important just to improve the diversity of chemistry as is, because it is, as you said, not very diverse.
No, and I would say if I could just impugn my own field, organic chemistry just traditionally is a conservative field, and I don't mean conservative based on political party or presidential candidate or anything like that. I just mean slow to change. And we all want it to be a more diverse, inclusive place, and we want diverse perspectives. We want that to be the strength of our field of science. But it takes work, and it takes support mechanisms. You have to reach out to people, and you have to. It's not enough just to admit. It's not as simple. That's why I like say it doesn't have a lot of impact on admission. Admitting a student from a background is only step one. Supporting that student for their entire PhD is what really matters. So that's a whole lot to pack into that question, but my advice: self-identify.
Love it.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much, Jared, for joining us today on this episode. Of course. And we'll have Jared on for another episode that we'll talk about visitation and what to do once you've been applying, or once you've actually been accepted to grad school. So we will see you there.
Okay. So how did that go for you?
I think it went well. I'm excited to be back. How about you?
I am super excited to be back. I've been waiting to do a new episode with you for so long, but life has just been in our way in addition to other projects. So we never really got around to it, but this was super exciting. And I was just going to say that it's kind of really nice to have these types of conversations with our PhD advisor. Now that we're outside of our jobs, we've met him once or twice at this point, after graduate school.
Several times.
But now that we're adults, I don't know.
Adults? We've been adults the whole time.
I mean, but now that we're really adults,
now that we have jobs.
Now we have jobs.
Now that we're out of academia.
Yeah. Now that he's not our boss, but he's someone we know and that we've known for a long time. It was a nice conversation.
I think this is going to be really useful for students, because it's good for not just students that are applying this year, because it is kind of a little crunch time. We wanted to release this earlier, but life got in the way. But it'll be useful for years to come, because like Jared said in the episode, grad admissions haven't changed for 32 years.
Literally, that was crazy. But I also feel like we didn't really get to touch upon this, but how much time do you give yourself, right, to just apply?
Oh, yeah.
Because that's not something we talked about, but, and I don't think there's a hard and fast rule with it, but I kind of feel like a year out is a good amount of time. People, if you're thinking about going to graduate school next year, you should thinking about applying next year. I feel like you should start thinking about the process now, because the preparatory work just can take time.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was, in the sense that in my fourth year because I did 5 years, as we have discussed, in my fourth year, I made the decision to not apply. So I certainly was thinking about it a year out, because I was like, okay, am I ready? Well, no. And I wasn't thinking about it my third year, because I had just started at UCSD. But anyway, so I think it's good to at least think about. So hopefully you're thinking about it.
And just to give yourself the time to, because I don't know, doing a lot of the preparatory work, especially with choosing labs, requires a level of research and knowing how to look for things. And you don't want to do that part in a rush. I would say if I were to break it down in terms of the entire admissions or application kind of cycle into different phases, the first phase is preparation, right? Where preparation is you doing a little bit of research into the schools you want to go to, the programs you want to go to, which professors look interesting. So give yourself some time to talk to people, because I think if anything, the most important part of this process is that, you're most likely not going to be the best person to decide which schools you're going to get into, right? Most of us are going to either overestimate ourselves or underestimate ourselves. And so you kind of want to have a dialogue with somebody who you trust and who has a good handle in the situation to give you the best, collection of schools to apply to. I was curious, who did you end up asking? Did you end up asking your boss?
Yeah, I asked my boss at the company I was working for.
Yeah, I only say that because I know you didn't have a traditional undergraduate research experience.
Yeah, so I didn't really have. Well, I actually had a friend who went to Yale. And so I had talked to her about her experience applying the year before. But not really about where to apply, just her experience, really.
Maybe that's why we didn't get into as many schools as Jared apparently seems to think we should have. He said,
I got into 3 schools. I got into 1/3 of the school I applied to.
You only got into Davis schools, and I got into NYU and Davis.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about NYU. Sorry.
That's
Yeah,
okay. I forget
yeah.
about it too.
And on that note, I'm just kidding.
No, okay, so it's actually like it's so funny. I mean, I'm excited to talk about visitation next week, which I think we're going to
Yes.
do. And I say that because like NYU, I'll say this again on the next episode, but I don't remember going to NYU's visitation. So I'm like dubious as to whether or not I even like went and like
Oh,
to scope it
really?
out. Like maybe I was just very like, I'm not going to NYU. Like the choice was really easy for me.
Oh, yeah. I
Um,
went to all three. It was so fun.
Good.
I
Okay, I'm
loved
excited
it.
to hear about it.
Yeah.
Is there
I
anything
don't
else you
think,
want to
yeah.
say about graduate school admissions
Admissions.
before we peace out?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to remember is that if you don't get into the school that you want to, one application cycle, if it's like your dream school, there's always so many things that go into actually getting accepted. So if you apply the next year, there's always a chance that you'll get in. I actually remember one of my TAs at UCSD, she didn't get into any grad schools when she first applied to grad school, like did not get into a single one. And then I don't remember how long she took in between, maybe a year or so. And then she reapplied and then she got into UCSD, which is an excellent school. So
Awesome.
you can do that and get in. It's not always, it's not lost. All is not lost.
Inspirational.
Yeah, I think so. So one thing I was thinking about this conversation is that I'm really grateful to be able to have these conversations with our PhD advisor. And so in context of applying to grad school, remembering that you're picking the place that you're going to meet this person who will have a super huge impact on your career and honestly probably life, as someone who you'll be in contact with for a very long time. So I'm just grateful that we were able to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we're kind of lucky in this way because not everybody has that kind of experience, but I think we should all be going into graduate school with that as like a hope, maybe like an
Hmm.
optimistic hope of what it could turn into. Like this could be a really positive relationship that you have for the rest of your life
Hmm.
if, you know, we all made the right decisions or if we all like if things go well. That's the
Yeah.
best case scenario. Things don't always go well, and that's fine. But yeah, I feel very lucky too. It was a nice
Yeah.
conversation,
Yeah.
and I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know before, which is I know it shouldn't be shocking to me, but I feel like I just didn't like.
Like I wish I knew that 7 years
Yeah,
ago.
like it's so crazy. I mean, this and it just reinforces why we're even doing this podcast in the first place because I
Yeah.
constantly have to remind myself like there are a lot of things that seem more obvious to me now, but like 22, 23-year-old Anna was did not know these
Knew
things.
nothing.
No
Yeah.
access to these things either as like a first
Yeah.
gen student with, you know, like
Yeah.
so I'm really hoping that this brings, you know, potential graduate students some type of clarity, a little bit of direction, just general like you know, peeling away the mask on the admissions process just a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better what you are going into. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. I think so too. I think it's really important looking back on. I actually, in the middle of the episode, I still have the email that I sent to Jared before I applied to grad school. He was on the admissions committee actually, so he couldn't really reply. And I was like, was I one of those people? What did I say? And I asked him if he would talk about his research with me. So, and I like sent my CV and everything, but
Yeah.
I did
Yeah.
not.
Okay.
He couldn't respond to me. Conflict of interest or whatever, I think.
Oh,
That's the impression that I got from the email was like, I'm
okay.
on the admissions committee, so I'll read your application. So
That makes
very
sense.
like,
That does obviously make sense.
yeah,
I don't know if we want to include this, but I'm basically the Nepo baby. Like when he was talking about like, oh, like if I know this PI really well, who's like writing the
yeah.
letter of recommendation, like it means more to me than like someone I don't know. And I was like, yeah, that's me. I'm the
Mhm.
Nepo baby.
I'm the Nepo baby. You were, we have already talked about you being the Nepo baby, but
I'm the
you
Nepo
know,
baby.
the other thing I wanted to say that, I mean, I know this and we've talked about this a lot, but like on some level with grad admissions, I feel like there is a little bit of backroom deals. Like it's a small world. It's not backroom
Yeah,
deals, right? But it's a small world. So you know, if this professor is writing this letter of rec about this student, there's a good chance that it means something or, I mean, it'll
it's
always
true.
mean something. Yeah.
I've seen it happen in like real time, especially at like the higher level schools that you go to, like the more kind of prestigious schools that
Hmm.
you go to. Um, you definitely, that definitely exists. I don't want to gaslight anybody into thinking that this is like a totally fair and everybody is, being
Yeah.
considered equal process. Like, especially if your target is like the MIT, Harvard's, Stanford of it all, like those schools definitely have a pre-existing network. I mean, if UC Davis has a pipeline school, those schools have
Yeah.
pipelines. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
dude, no,
and
for
that's
sure.
no shade to UC Davis. Like, it's just Davis is a public school. Like, it's a very chill school. So if even Davis
Yeah.
kind of has a pipeline, you can only imagine what the pipelines are at
Yeah.
like the private
I mean,
schools.
I think they're everywhere, right? You can't,
Hmm.
but I think that's one thing that's really important about just life is networking is really important. And like it,
Yeah,
unfortunately, the people you know are very important. And so one thing we didn't talk about actually was the resources of a school when you're choosing whether to apply there or not,
that's
because
right.
one thing, like the reputation of a school doesn't really matter that much, as Jared said. But one thing about like the better schools, if you will, they typically have more funding, more resources. And we've talked about this before, but it just gives students access to better opportunities sometimes. So
It's never
it's
like
something,
a, I
yeah,
would say like you're super right about that. And like everybody
yeah.
who's applying for grad school, I understand the mentality. You want to shoot your shot and get into the best possible school that you can, that you
Hmm.
feel like you're qualified for. And I think you should
Yeah,
still do that. I just think don't sweat the little stuff though. Like
yeah, for sure, for
the
sure.
top 20 schools, like I will
Top
say
30.
top 30 even, like they have similar access to they should definitely have enough resources to do the research that they do for being a top 30 school. And like if you think about it, like you know top 10 and top 1 or top 15 and top 1, like that distance isn't so
Yeah.
egregious that like let's say you went to a top 15 school, that doesn't mean that your career is over. I mean, if anything, like I'm
We
gonna
went
just
to
say it. When
top
we
30.
went to UC, we went to no, actually we were 33, and now it's dipped a little bit. So like I just
Has
want
it
to.
gone
But
lower?
what I'm trying to say is like ultimately, like
Hmm.
I'm currently working right now with people who went to top 10 schools, okay,
Hmm.
for their PhDs. We have the same position. We're getting paid the same amount of money. That's all I want
Yeah.
to say. I just feel like, yes, I would want to get into the best program possible, okay? But it's not the end of the world for you as a chemist if you don't get into a top 10 school. I just want to say that.
I totally agree because there are people who went to top 10 schools that um they're not that they're not all
They're
that.
not
I'll
all
tell you that
that.
right now.
Whoa. She said it
Yeah.
here. She said, say
Yeah.
their names.
No, I wouldn't.
But yeah, it's like with anything in life, like
Yeah.
it's not the end of the world. I understand that we all want to get into better and better schools and stuff, but ultimately, if you get into a school and you like it, you're gonna do pretty well just by like keeping your head down into the research, doing the best that you can, and trust the process. You know, IDK. Totally not with Sweetman
Absolutely.
still.
Trust the process. So, we've been MIA for a while, and that's just because life was hectic. I moved to another country, and so things just have not been going as planned. So, we've kind of committed to a schedule. Anna, what's our schedule?
We're going to hopefully release 2 episodes a month. Ideally, they're going to be 2 weeks apart. We'll see. The holidays are coming up, so that might interfere with things here and there. But overall, I think Mina and I are both really excited to produce some more graduate student related content. Maybe some other things as well, like sprinkled here and there, just for our like fun. We don't know if it'll catch on or not, but you know, we if you put us in a room together,
We can talk about
we've
anything.
found out this this entire time we can talk for like 3 hours, no problem. Now the question is,
About anything.
Can we talk about something in 1 hour? That's going to
No.
be our goal moving forward. We may or
Yeah.
may not meet this goal, but yeah, we're super excited to share some more conversations with you. Hopefully, have a few more guests this time around. And yeah, I
Yeah.
kind of consider this to be our kind of like second season
Season
of the
2. Yes.
podcast.
Agreed.
So
Also, if you have any opinions on what we should talk about or different conversation topics, feel free to comment down below and let us know, or send us a DM on Instagram, whatever you want to let us know what you think. Thanks. Bye.
bye.